Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mohit. I'll be moderating the session for all of you today. I see lots and lots of people. I think AKB, you should be very happy about it. And with the rains in Gurgaon especially, we were wondering whether we will have a full house, but it looks like we definitely have a full house. But today, we are here to build that relationship of how the economies are built, how the finance plays that role. And in that entire conundrum, what's the role of the finance minister and the other stakeholders alongside with the Prime Minister, RBI, Planning Commission, and the entire set of the Secretariat. This is an interesting discussion. This book itself is a very, very unique book. This has history, this has policy making into it. This book has, I should say, a lot of lessons on social sciences. So that's why this is a very unique combination of picking up history as a use case, building the narrative around it, and also telling you what happens when policymakers come together and there's a role of the finance minister in that. That's why we were very happy to partner with some academic institutions today who are part of the Friends of Books network, who have been very anxious and very keen to support this book as part of the reading material and use it in a very innovative way when the students will be taught policy making, especially on the finance and economy side. The story of 11 finance ministers. Out of those, 2 did their terms twice. Interestingly, out of the 11 chapters, the time for C.D. Deshmukh's chapter took me the longest, especially with the correlation of IIC, one of the founders of IIC. So it's very important to give the tribute to C.D. Deshmukh, the 4th finance minister of the country, 3rd, sorry. I may be wrong with the numbers and remembering the history that way. But, and the accompanying relationships amongst this entire set of people is very important. That's what we will discuss today. And we are very thankful to AKB for bringing the best set of people for this panel, for this discussion. We have a very special surprise for all of you as well with a very eminent panel. We also have a very special guest with us as Dr. T.V. Somanathan, who is presently the Finance Secretary. I would now request him to come over and give his views on the book that he has bought very passionately covered in a wrap. Please, sir, we'll request everyone to give a big round of applause to Mr. T.V. Somanathan.
Mr. Bhattacharya, distinguished panelists, friends, ladies and gentlemen. It's customary to say that it's a great pleasure to be here, but I actually mean it. I think it's a very pleasurable experience for me to be able to be here and talk about this particular book. It's a superb book by a masterly author. Finance secretaries live in dread of those who write about the inner workings of the finance ministry, and ordinarily I wouldn't have come. But thankfully, the inner workings that we are talking about today are at least 46 years old. So I was bold enough to show up. And from a civil servant's perspective, whatever was dangerously political 46 plus years ago is not very political today. So it's relatively safe, and civil servants like to be safe. The Reserve Bank has a 5-volume official history. The State Bank of India has an official history. The World Bank has an official history of its first 50 years, but to my knowledge, there is no official history of the finance ministry. This book is so good that I think it actually functions almost like an official history of the finance ministry through its coverage of the finance ministers between 1947 and 1977. It is, however, different from an official history in as much as it is more objective than most official histories are. This book has been written with the highest standards of fairness, objectivity, and neutrality in its treatment of its subjects. It's very carefully written, and the language is very precise, which is always pleasing for a civil servant to see, because precision in writing things is very important to us. There's no suggestio falsi anywhere, no innuendo, but at the same time, there is no suppressio veri, and there is no pulling of punches. So this combination makes it a very valuable work for both people who are in the economic present and those who are studying the economic past. For me, the most interesting learning from this book is that the issues of the modern era are not very modern. In fact, they are the old issues that all people in the finance ministry used to face, is probably the most important learning that I received from this book. So let me mention just 3 of many such issues that struck me. First, the issue of independence of central banks. Second, the issue of whether law enforcement actions are political or not. And third, whether finance ministers should be politicians or experts. And this book casts light on all 3 of these questions from a much earlier era. So let me read you 3 short extracts on these 3 topics to give you a flavor of what you can find in this book. I've been very selective in the extracts that I've chosen. So let me start with page 117. And I'll just read out an extract. This is on central bank independence. Now we are talking about a time when the Prime Minister was Jawaharlal Nehru, and this is about a time when the then Finance Minister was having a disagreement with the Reserve Bank. And I'll start reading here. The Finance Minister duly forwarded the resolution to Jawaharlal Nehru, who took little time to write to the RBI governor a letter indicating that he was completely on the side of the finance minister and that his government had taken the first big step in dispelling the notion of RBI's independence. And then it goes on. He took serious objection to the extraordinary manner in which the RBI governor had spoken to the directors of the central board about how the government move had undermined the central bank's autonomy. He goes on, I skip a few lines. The central government is directing, this is a quotation from the Prime Minister, the central government is directing its policy to attain certain objectives laid down in the 5-year plan. It would be completely absurd if the Reserve Bank followed a different policy because it did not agree with those objectives or with the methods of achieving them. Again, I skip a few lines. And this again, I'm quoting the Prime Minister then. You have laid stress on the autonomy of the Reserve Bank. Certainly, it is autonomous, but it is also subject to the central government's directions. Okay. I'll go on to the issue of whether law enforcement actions are political or not. So again, I read from page 71. The political significance of establishing the Commission of Inquiry against Dalmia can hardly be ignored. Dalmia was not just one of the leading industrialists of the country, but had been deeply associated with the country's political leaders before partition as well as after independence. He had relations with Mahatma Gandhi, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and Jawaharlal Nehru. However, he was seen to be closer to Jinnah, and that proximity is believed to have strained his relations with Nehru. I skip a few lines. It is not clear if Deshmukh's, that is the finance minister's, moves on initiating the inquiry into Dalmia's business activities received any encouragement from Nehru. But that Nehru did not oppose his finance minister's action against Dalmia must have had its own unstated political resonance. I'll read one last piece, and this is about who the finance minister should be. Should it be a politician or should it be an expert, etc.? There was a clear pattern in Nehru's choice of finance ministers. The preference was for a professional expert, an economist, or a retired civil servant. And then I skip a few lines. Morarji Desai had differed with Nehru's belief that only an expert in financial matters should be considered fit to become the finance minister. Instead, the more important attribute of a finance minister, according to Desai, was that he must be a member of the Congress party. That was necessary in view of the criticality of the functions of the finance minister. Nehru became curious. He wanted to know what Desai thought were the key attributes necessary for a finance minister. Desai lost no time in listing out 4 conditions that a finance minister must fulfill. 1. The person chosen as the finance minister must enjoy the Prime Minister's full confidence. And just as the Prime Minister must be confident that the person chosen to be Finance Minister would be able to discharge his responsibilities competently, the Finance Minister should also have complete confidence in his own abilities. Okay. 2, the Finance Minister must be a full-fledged party man, believing in the ideals and the programs of the party and also in implementing them. 3, the entire country must have full faith in the integrity of the person chosen as the finance minister. And 4, the person chosen to be the finance minister should have the required intelligence and common sense to seek the help of experts and benefit from their advice to arrive at a proper decision and implement it. Nehru had concurred with Desai's analysis. So these are 3 extracts of what I found very, very, very resonant with current discussions on various topics. And as they say in French, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. I mean, the more things change, the more they are the same. So in conclusion, let me again congratulate Mr. Bhattacharya on a book that leaves me eagerly looking forward to the next volume and hoping that he will stop well before 2014. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will invite Dr. Somanathan again on the stage along with our eminent panelist and also Manish, because it's customary to do that. We have a photo opportunity of the book with everyone. May I now request everyone to be on the stage, please. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, sir, Mr. Desai, Mr. Narayanan, Mr. Acharya, please come. Sir, please.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for the encouragement. Fantastic.
So friends of books, in fact, I must say, we will now have our regular format of the panel discussion. It's a very well curated panel. In fact, Dr. Ahluwalia was telling me कि पर्चा लीक तो नहीं किया तुमने तो questions भेजे ही नहीं, right? So the पर्चा is not leaked, sir. We have some interesting questions, which we will have AKB to comment on them as well once our panelists will speak about them. Also, we have, since we have limited time, we have a lot of content to cover. You would have received the booklet. If you have not, please ask it from the neighbors who are next to you if they have the booklet. The booklets have the introductions. And also, towards the end of the panel discussion, in case you have questions, please do write them on the question, that sheet that is being given. If you want to use it, my colleague Ridhima and others will help you with that. And once the questions come to us, we will be able to moderate them properly, what question to pick, not in any specific order, but seeing the relevance to the discussion. So we should have with you, as the first question, Mr. Narayan, considering you are leading it. Sir Nageswaran, sorry, I've written the short form. It's for you, sir, because you are leading it from the front. And what is this book to you? While Dr. Somanathan has given a preview of it, but as the Chief Economic Advisor, you are on the driving seat right now. What is this book to you? Is it a manual to refer? And if you have to recommend to everyone else, what would you recommend about this book to everyone?
Thank you, and good evening to everybody. Thank you, AKB, for inviting me to be on this panel. And as Somanathan said, participating in these book launches is something I like only because it gives me the opportunity to get away from the day-to-day document reading and focus on something that is distant, giving you perspective. So even though I couldn't do full justice to the 400 plus pages, so I could do some justice to it. The reason why I would recommend this book to youngsters today, suppose AKB has called this book The History of Finance Ministry in India. I don't think many would pick it up. But to put it this way, it is like giving philosophical insights through stories. I think economic history also has to be made interesting and relevant for today's students. And that is what AKB has done. That is my first reason for recommending this book. Because if you read this book, first of all, it is not dense, although the topic can easily be made more dense. And he chose to avoid that. There are no dense footnotes either. The narrative flows very seamlessly. And although some of my lines were stolen by my good friend and colleague Somanathan, I have to point, because it looks like 50% of my points were already stated here. So the important thing, it gives us a sense of how much the policy making between 1947 and 1980 was influenced by the thinking. that government had to be in the driver's seat. And by the way, it was not just an India-centric approach, because post-World War II, given the extensive damage caused to private sector capacity around the world, the catch-up growth was always supposed to be led by the government. So in that sense, the government of India followed what was the extant wisdom at that point. And I think this book brings out, but also it brings out in great detail with enormous insight, how that model of government being in the driver's seat went to excessive lengths in terms of almost planning to the last nuts and bolt that is being made in the country. The government would tell you what specification they should have. So I think that comes out very clearly. And then also the fact that the book stops at 1977 is interesting, because post-1980s the world changed.
Yeah.
Globalization became the norm, and India also actually began its slow liberalization process. After Mrs. Indira Gandhi came back to office in 1980, Mr. R. Venkatraman became the finance minister, and a lot of things began to change very slowly in India. So in that sense, the book kind of stops at a point where I think the policy making in India also began to shift. So it was sort of two or three epoch. So these are the main reasons I would recommend this book to students, because you may not pick up a copy of Economic History of India, but you should pick up this copy, and that will give you a very good economic history of India. I'll stop here.
Not only the students, but to the people who have passed out a couple of years ago, this will refresh and also will help you how the design thinking process that might go into policy making may help. AKB, any of your comments on this, please?
No, I think let the experts speak. I have done my.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. That's you, AKB, for sure. I come to Shankar Acharya, sir, to you, because you have been the longest serving economic advisor. That's how we have been able to see it. Chief Economic Advisor, yes. And it was your stint in the World Bank where you saw the things happening from the other side, especially the Indian economy. And for those years, while the FMs like finance ministers like Y.B. Chavan and C. Subramaniam, and even while you were studying and writing your dissertation, how do you connect it to the research that A K Bhattacharya has done in this book? Any of your narrative, any specific thoughts which you could relate from those times, from your studies as well as while you were serving?
On one of the three thematic themes that Honorable Finance Secretary picked up to kind of whet the appetite of readers, I have to share a sort of pithy little comment from a very good friend of mine who was a very distinguished central bank Reserve Bank governor, and this is on the issue of the independence or otherwise of the RBI from the government. As he said, I think, at some public occasion, the Reserve Bank of India is independent, and I have my minister's permission to say so. And now, turning to the book, we all know that Mr. Ashok Bhattacharya has been one of the finest economic journalist, editor in the country for the last 30-40 years. And in the last couple of decades that I've got to know him, through some association with the Business Standard, I think he was initially, at least when I started, managing editor, I think was the term. And then he became, at some point, editor. Yeah. And now he is, of course, the editorial director. Yes. So if you notice, the term editor is common to all three in some fashion, and fittingly so. Now, so we know him in that capacity, but I think that this volume really establishes him as a very scholarly economic historian. And it's a dimension of him that I didn't know about, and it's been a pleasure to get to know that dimension by reading his very fine book. Now, the objective, as he in his introduction says, of the book is to present India's economic history through the eyes of the finance ministers. I think it's almost a direct quote. I think he accomplishes this objective superbly and with some very fine writing. I personally learnt a huge amount from reading this book, and I recommend it very, very strongly to everyone here, and indeed to everyone who has an interest in India's economic history. But if you like, breaking from tradition, I'm going to have a quibble about the book instead of just paying compliments. My one quibble or reservation is that by seeing economic history through the eyes of the FMs, he, I think, also ends up by being too kind to his protagonists. Of course, Ashok is by nature a very kind and nice person, so I don't expect him to have done otherwise. But why do I say what I just said? Two broad reasons. I think we have to remind ourselves that between 1950 and 1980, which is roughly corresponds to, not quite, but roughly to the period he has, India's economic growth averaged about 3.5% a year. What Professor Raj Krishna, the late lamented Professor Raj Krishna, rather memorably dubbed as the Hindu rate of growth. And that meant that, because of population growth at that time, that the per capita growth was a very modest 1.5%. Now, this might have been acceptable in the first half of this period. After all, in the half a century before that period, during colonial times, I believe India's growth was about 1%, and per capita growth was close to 0. So you can always say, look, we did 3 times better than that, or whatever. But I don't think after mid-60s, or perhaps at least 1970, after that, this is at all an acceptable rate of growth for what we could have done and should have done. And in a way, many of the policies which constrained our economic growth, in my view, and which we've been trying to reform, people like Mr. Shomanathan, one or two of us here, and of course the finance ministers that followed the group of this 3 decades, many of those policies were spawned in these first 30 years. And surely, in an objective sense, the FMs of those years should shoulder some of the blame. Let me very quickly, time permitting, give you some examples of what I regard as possibly wrong policies. First, I mean, we know that import restrictions, quantitative restrictions, and so on were a very big problem, and they came out to be a big problem in the 1970s, 80s, and so forth. I was educated by reading this book to learn that the first serious mention of import restrictions in a budget speech is in the first budget of the government of India after independence by Mr. Shanmugam Jetty, where he goes on to say we need to restrict imports, and then he gives a 3-fold classification: free, restricted, and prohibited. And this reminds me of my youthful days of going to CCIE and sitting through import licensing committees. So, I mean, it's there. Second, the Industries Development and Regulation Act, which was passed in 1951, when Deshmukh was FM, laid the basis for state control over licensing and establishing public enterprises. And later, of course, this was greatly strengthened in the 1956 Industrial Policy Resolution. Now, intentions were very honorable, very good. Development is what we wanted and still want of industry. But I would argue that in the latter part, particularly, of those 30 years, the regulation part, the edifice of industrial licensing that we built up, held back our economic growth and our industrial development very severely. And that's what much of the policies, the so-called 91 reforms, in fact dealt with. Rakesh Mohan is here, and I think he was at the heart of much of that de-licensing and so forth. So he can elaborate at great length on this, which I won't. Thirdly, in the last 20 years or more, last 30 years, we've been concerned about do we have too much of nationalized banks, state-owned banks in our system? And I think the general consensus, perhaps not full consensus, but a general consensus has been yes. And successive governments have made statements. I remember helping draft Mr. Ashwin Sinha's one of his budget speeches in the late 90s about bringing down the share of government to 33% from above 51%. Of course, it didn't happen. Started when? Well, the Imperial Bank of India was nationalized, again during the time of Mr. Deshmukh, who I think you admire, in 1955. And then, of course, in the great sweep of 1969, when Indira Gandhi was both PM and I think she was also FM, and she nationalized then 14 largest private sector banks. You take the example of nationalization of life insurance in 1956 by Deshmukh, again something we pedaled back on. Then the very strong control over foreign exchange allocation through FERA particularly, since 1957 was ushered in, I think, during TTK's time. As I read through the book, I discerned the continuous pattern of raising import duties in nearly all budgets, both for reasons of revenue and for protection reasons. Now, both of these, I think, have been very deliberately reversed in the years since, except perhaps some would argue in very recent years. A similar proliferation and increases also occurred with excise duties, including on very major inputs. Once again, I think the burden of our policies since then has been very different, to try and do things differently to have a better taxation system. And income tax rates were raised continuously until they touched the marginal rate, I believe, 97.5%, somewhere in the 1970s. Then, touching on the theme of autonomy between RBI and the government, the inauguration of the system of ad hoc treasury bills, I believe occurred in 1955, again under the Honorable Mr. Deshmukh. I'm not even sure he was aware of it. Mr. Ahluwalia can speak to that, perhaps, because I know he's written about it. Because I believe at the official level, and I don't know at what low or high level, this agreement was reached, and which essentially it meant that the government could borrow at will through ad hoc treasury bills directly from the Reserve Bank of India, which in turn meant that the fiscal deficit could be monetized at will by the government, and it totally undercut, potentially, modern monetary policy. And it was reversed during a period of 94 to 97 in a phased manner, and the agreement was signed by my good friend Montek for the government, I believe, and by Dr. Rangarajan on the other side. So, and then of course we mustn't forget the Gold Control Order of 1963 under Morarji Desai, which I think people like Mr. Dawood would have been very thankful for. So it is a mixed blessing, I would say, of those 30 years of policy, and I think you've been too kind.
Okay.
But despite that, I must thank you, certainly on my behalf, but I'm sure on everybody else's, for a wonderful gift you've given us all. Thank you.
My next question is definitely to Montek Singh Ahluwalia, sir, to you. But before coming to that, I think you mentioned about the Dawood's role and the gold smuggling. And this brings me to another villain from Bollywood, which is Ajit, and where he says, Mona Yellow Sona. And that was the way the country was depicted, where the gold was the key item, and the smuggling rates were as high as part of a percentage of the GDP. Also, during the same time, while quoting C.D. Deshmukh, and the year when he quit, 1956, that was also the year when the song came, Ae Dil Hai Mushkil Jeena Yahan. I'm not talking about Delhi, it was Bombay. And there was a song that came which was actually depicting the state of what we were in. it was a time of C.D. Deshmukh going out, a lot of decisions were pending, but definitely Planning Commission played a very important role in this entire duration. So my next question to you, sir, because this is something where the Kunji was not passed and you had no idea that this question is coming, and AKB and I, we decided that this should come out because that will bring out a very important aspect of the book where Planning Commission has been quoted in almost every chapter in a way that it's playing a very important role. Apart from other stakeholders with FM and RBI, Planning Commission actually embarked on a very unique relationship, sir. And the unique, why I'm saying it was sensitive as well as courageous at many times. Of course, due to its positioning. And AKB has given a lot of instances. In a very polite way, he has mentioned many times of the Planning Commission's overall challenges, the issues that they were solving. Why don't you quote something from some of your chapters where you think that the Planning Commission could have been given more freedom, where you think it would have done better if something would have been changed? That's my question to you, sir.
Well, thanks very much. First of all, thank you for inviting me. And let me join others who have said that this is really an excellent book. And AKB, I think we're now like TTK, we're calling you AKB.
Don't say TTK.
I think you really, you've done a signal service in the sense that, we've heard a lot about economic reforms, and unfortunately this book doesn't even go into that period. I mean, that's the most important thing. He tells me he's threatening to write 2 subsequent books. So this book ends with the emergency. So I'm not going to comment on anything afterwards because I want to see what he really says about that period. But I will talk about the issues that you raised here. It's a little bit, I'm sorry that I'm avoiding a direct question. But I prepared myself to say other things. My father once told me a story about when he was in school, there was a kid with him who, preparing for the maths exam, decided that proving the binomial theorem was too complicated and it wasn't going to come. So he didn't prepare. So the second it came, and so he obviously missed out. The second year he said, "Ab to nahi aayega." But again the damn thing came. The third year, he said, "Look, I am damn well going to make sure he learned that thing up properly," and didn't come. So the kid said, "First, let me prove the binomial theorem," and then submitted the rest of the answer. I'm going to do that. I'm going to say what I wanted to say, and I'll pitch in a little bit on the late lamented Planning Commission. Now, what I found most fascinating is that it's not an economic history. It's like flying over the period and giving you good views on individual things. I mean, to be an economic history, you have to go into all the pros and cons, and there's a role for that. But I think what he's done is superb, because if you're interested in what it was like, it brings out a lot of real things. And I just want to comment on some of those before I come to the Planning Commission. The first I thought was very interesting was that we all think that, many of us, Shankar obviously and I too, that, we developed too many controls. And this is usually attributed to the influence of P.C. Mahalanobis, who was the founding father of the second 5-year plan, who created this notion of, capital goods that produce capital goods are very good. Anything that produces a consumer good is bad. Somebody in the World Bank a long time ago had told me that why does India work on a theory which says that anything that produces something that somebody wants to consume is anti-development, and only if you produce a capital good, and preferably a capital good that produces a capital good, that you're really pro-development. So I think this was, in my mind, interesting story that is in this book, which is about Panditji. And the TTK family had a license application to produce some product for ponds. And Rajagopalachari, who was then the Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu, rejected that on the grounds, very sensible grounds. He said Sita didn't have any need for this sort of stuff. So why should Indian women want it? Now, TTK, because the application had come from one of his family firms, recused himself. So the file went to Panditji. Now, Panditji, who was believed to be, later on anyway, a great devotee or a supporter of P.C. Mahalanobis, looked at this thing and commented, according to the book, it's a delightful comment. He said, Sita was naturally beautiful. But now this becomes a controversial subject, so feminists may object to the statement. But see, every Indian woman is not necessarily that well endowed. And so she should be given all the support she needs. So let's approve the thing. So it was a classic early case that Pandit Nehru didn't have the kind of prejudice against consumer goods that is usually attributed to his government later on. I thought that was wonderful that he brought it up. On Deshmukh, you rightly say we are sitting in the IIC, which was, after all, something that he made possible to our great advantage. But one of the things that's most interesting in the book is Deshmukh's role during the state's reorganization. Because AKB points out that when the state's reorganization, the Fazl Ali Committee came up with their recommendation, they actually just hived off a few things from the old Bombay state. And they didn't actually recommend splitting Bombay and Gujarat. They just said that maybe we should separate out Vidarbha as a separate state and leave Maharashtra, Gujarat with Bombay inside it as a state. And that led to many of the non-Marathi speaking people, because they would now become a larger proportion of the state that didn't have Vidarbha in it, feel that, look, this is, giving too much importance and may not work too well, etc. And Deshmukh was asked to sort out this problem. So what he came up with was an interesting solution. He persuaded the Vidarbha people that, look, we don't have Vidarbha. We can have Maharashtra, but we'll have Bombay city will become a separate state altogether. Okay, and that ran into other controversies, riots, and this, that, and the other. Actually, Panditji declared that it was not going to be a state; it was going to be a union territory. That led to an enormous explosion. That you're denying Bombay statehood. It's worth going through all that, because many, many, many years later, when financial liberalization was being talked about, Mr. Chidambaram had appointed a committee that how do we really promote global integration of the Indian financial sector? And the guy who did this report came to the conclusion that the way to do this is to make Bombay a separate state. He wasn't actually aware of the fact that this had come up earlier, but it's quite interesting to see how ideas that surfaced at a certain time resurface again. And it's actually quite interesting whether Panditji was right or not right in making Bombay, if it was separate, a union territory. The idea would be that as a union territory, it would sort of serve a global purpose, but it would still be under the control of the central government. A lot of what we see now going on, the debates in Delhi, should it be a union territory, is it got enough freedom, etc., they're all kind of presaged in this particular instant. I thought one of the nice things about it was that the book makes it clear that, speeches by finance ministers are usually so formula driven to be almost useless. And nobody in the finance ministry would say that. And certainly when I was there as finance minister, I wouldn't have said it. But now that I'm kind of an ex-finance secretary, finance ministry person, here is a very interesting list of what Deshmukh in early August 1950 described as what were going to be his basic pillars of the budget. And here they are. Number one, follow sound fiscal and monetary policy. No surprise there. Second, no relaxation in the pursuit of economy. Again, no surprise there. The stress of the Indian economy from its economic relations with neighboring countries is a problem. We must handle it. Plan for self-sufficiency in food, cotton, and jute. Then, maximize industrial production. Take steps to alleviate rural unemployment and make a close vigil on inflation. So, this is 1950. So actually it'd be quite interesting to get some student to examine whether there has been any significant departure in the sort of general purpose statements that finance ministers make. In which case, I mean, future finance ministers would be well advised to say, I subscribe to the historical tradition of objectives which are listed in Annex 1, and then go on to the main speech. In many ways, I think Manmohan Singh's speech in 1991 is rightly described, in my view, as epoch-making or whatever, historical, because it didn't talk about the budget. Virtually every important thing that was done by 1991 had been done before the budget. So the budget speech was a rationalization of the case for economic reforms. Except for that, everybody else has done the same thing. So I thought it was quite interesting that you dug it out in 1950. 2 or 3 more comments and then I'll stop. You know, the thing is full of discussions on this great push for investment in the 1960s, which actually led to a balance of payments crisis and created problems and so on. Now, it's very interesting that, you know, at that time, and here the book doesn't actually mention this, I think, at that time, Milton Friedman had visited the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission comes back in. Yeah. He wanted the advice of Milton Friedman, and I suspect that the bureaucrats in those days might have felt that the safest thing to do is to put him in the Planning Commission so he won't be bothering up with. So he spent a couple of months in the Planning Commission and produced a note, which is now public and available. And Friedman's main recommendation to Pandit Nehru was that you're worrying too much about capital investment and not worrying enough about human investment. It's interesting that in the literature on human development, this advice is normally first attributed to Amartya Sen. And of course, Amartya did excellent work pointing it out. But again, historically, it goes back to the early 60s, when this is what Milton Friedman said, that if we were to worry more about educating and training our population, we would do a lot better for development than what we are doing. And that comes out, that's something you might want to think of in a second edition.
Sure.
Check it out and make a reference to it. 2 more points. Oh, now you come to the Planning Commission, so I think I better say something about it. As you say, Mathai resigned on this issue. And you know, the resignation is usually presented, or maybe it's only presented in the Planning Commission, as a sort of a petty resignation. Actually, when you look at what is said here, Mathai made an extremely important point, which was also very critical in a way of the Planning Commission's functioning. Mathai said the case for having a Planning Commission, which Panditji believes you should have, is that the rest of the government is busy managing the economy, doing day-to-day things. We need someone to do long-term thinking. I mean, in a way, that was also the logic later on for abolishing the Planning Commission and creating something that would do long-term thinking. So the idea was there. But what he said is that the problem with the Planning Commission is it doesn't want to do any long-term thinking. It just wants to get involved in the management of the government. So it wants to get involved in every decision. Now the thing is that in government, since all decisions are taken interministerially, I mean, I know that people like to, even the import licensing decision used to be taken by a committee. Of course, the ministry that ran the committee controlled it, because first of all, it would be the senior most person from that ministry who would be chairing the committee, and everybody else would be one rank below. So it's very easy to listen to people and guide the thing in a particular way. But the interesting thing is that Mathai's complaint was that the Planning Commission will get involved in each of these things. The problem was that is what the whole of the government was doing. I mean, if you go through any of our decisions, our system of decision-making is interministerial, but each ministry simply takes its own ministerial view. Nobody sits around and says, this is a general problem, this is how we should handle it. So, of course, the Planning Commission did exactly that. And I think, frankly, this is an issue that, people very often in the corporate sector would say to us that, Saab, your planning is very good, but implementation is wrong. Now, this is just a nice way of saying, but what they had in mind was, just like Matthias' general objectives are very good, but by the time they get translated, they don't achieve those objectives. That was their complaint about a lot of the way government functioned. Now, I think we need to think about how we can make that happen better. But when one looks back, I personally think that Matthias had a good point there. I don't think we reacted to it, it just got lost somewhere in the process. Another issue that comes out very nicely in the book is the whole devaluation episode which involved Indira Gandhi. And one of the things that comes out there is that there was a lot of consultation. I mean, there were doubts. Obviously, devaluation was viewed everywhere, not just in India, everywhere as a sort of a bit of a loss of national pride and so forth. And Indira Gandhi didn't just decide on her own. I mean, she called K.N. Raj, she called Jagdish Bhagwati, they sat around and had a discussion, and in the end, some kind of a decision was taken that we need this money, and therefore we'll go along with the devaluation. So, the notion that government is consulting experts, I think it would be fair to say that at that time, since Raj and Bhagwati represented the two ends of the spectrum, I mean, it was well known that Raj was anti-devaluation and well known that Jagdish was pro. So both of them got a hearing in the process. The interesting thing, by the way, is that when it's mentioned here that, you don't mention the source for that, but I think you should. You mention here that when a proposal on what we should do was put up, I.G. Patel, who prepared the note, didn't actually recommend devaluation, although that was the whole purpose of the discussion.
I think it is I.G. Patel's own.
According to, I could read it out, but what you said is that Patel did not mention the need. He didn't say don't do it, but he didn't mention the need for it. I think the finance ministry, here one must make a point. And that is, when you put these things in the context of what is the literature of the time, the whole literature of the role of devaluation in a balance of payments adjustment actually goes back to 1963. So one view, Mundell, Fleming model and so on, which actually says that, look, if you want to bring the current account deficit down, you just have to have a devaluation. So it was in the literature, and therefore, if we were looking at how to reduce the current account deficit, somebody should have said it's good theory to have a devaluation. And as a matter of fact, if you don't have a devaluation and you want the same reduction in the current account deficit, you will actually have an excessive deflation. So the role of the devaluation is the switching of demand. This was known by 1963. But in the 1967 devaluation, I don't know. In fact, if you could get those papers, I don't know if anyone knew about it, because after all, it takes a long time for these things to filter in. Jagdish would certainly have known about it, and we know that he was consulted. But he was consulted by Mrs. Gandhi. She didn't have any of the finance ministry people around her at the time. So how far this fed into internal official decision making, I think, is an important point. Well, I could go on and on, but I think I've done enough to show. Oh yeah, one final point. And that was TTK, coming back to TTK, TTK's budget, where he slapped on one tax after another. The problem really was that we were aiming for too much in terms of the plan. We couldn't finance the plan of that size. So desperately needing resources. It's interesting that, Morarji Desai actually, from outside, after TTK took over, criticized TTK as Commerce Minister for having liberalized imports, which has caused the balance of payments crisis. There's a very interesting point that the deep-rooted belief that liberalizing imports causes balance of payments crisis, this is only valid if the exchange rate is not flexible. If the exchange rate is flexible, it doesn't cause a balance of payments crisis. And I've mentioned this in my book also. I think that failure to appreciate the economic theory behind a real exchange, the devaluation was, I think, unfortunate. I don't know whether it would have made a difference, by the way, because, you know, all over the world, even in England in those days, in 1967, I mean, Harold Wilson, I just left to go to university, and Britain had to devalue. And of course, it was very controversial there. And even in Britain, Harold Wilson said, in justifying devaluation, he said, the pound in your pocket is not worth any less, which of course is not true, because it was worth less, because import prices would go up. So these things weren't too well understood. I think it just gives a sense that, you know, when you're dealing with complex issues in policy, it's important for the public to be aware, if nothing in a simplified manner, what the arguments are. Otherwise, these arguments take place in some rarefied atmosphere and nobody understands what the hell to do. But, you know, TTK put forth all this expenditure tax, wealth tax, this, that, and invoked the majesty of Nicholas Caldor, admittedly a phenomenally distinguished economist from the UK. But they failed to mention that Caldor had said that the totality of all these taxes should not exceed 45%. Whereas in fact, each of these things was said, we already have very high taxes, let's slap on another expenditure tax, leading to marginal tax rates which were quite ridiculous. And that, of course, took some time to change. But anyway, thanks, a wonderful book which enables you to, as it were, navigate some of the rocks and slippery areas when you go through all these things. So, thank you.
Fantastic, sir. Other than the binomial theorem, I must say that you also touched upon Mathai, an ex-Tata director. You picked up the Ponds story. There's a relationship to the Tatas with the Lakme, and then coming back to levers that I'll mention in a while. But it's important to keep the Tata connect and invite Mr. Desai with us now, who's been a Tata man himself. And from his initial days with Tatas and then with Planning Commission, and later on as a chief economic advisor, sir. To you, I am assuming this book would have been like as if you're watching a movie and you are somewhere in that. You are seeing some things are happening. And you had a timing when Indira Gandhi gave the baton to YB Chavan. And you also saw emergency. You were part of it. You were there when things were happening. So you had seen the action from a very different seat in the balcony, I guess. I would like you to tell to the curious readers here, because I think we have built a lot of curiosity of all the readers who will pick up this book, will get it signed as well. How many of you have bought the book by now? Oh, very few hands. We want everyone to have the book. The most fascinating aspect of the book, that why this should be a must read, even if somebody doesn't come from a business or economics background, how will that be that fascination will bring to every reader per se? I know it's a tough one, but still, give it a try, sir.
Well, let me begin first by thanking Shok for what is an excellent book. I don't normally read book because of poor eyesight. I don't normally read long books, but I've read all 400 pages of your book because it was fascinating. This book is not just a standard economic history which throws lots of data at you. It's a narrative. It's a narrative which tells you the story of the decision-making processes in this period. And there are some things there which are fascinating. Even somebody like me of my age who's lived through some of those episodes found it fascinating to read about the details about the Mundra scandal, about the devaluation process. It's a long discussion of the arguments for and against the devaluation process. Incidentally, TTK was against devaluation, and that's what caused him a problem with Lal Bahadur Shastri. And it's fascinating to read these things in detail. It's really like a narrative telling you, which tells you some detail on what sort of arguments go on. So I really want to thank you.
Thank you.
You put in a lot of effort into this book, and I can see that you have quoted so many people who have written their biographies, autobiographies, etc. And I must thank you very much for this. For me, when I read this book, I would say there are two parts to it. There is one part of Indian economy development which I would call the Nehru era, which is up to about 1964. And that part is very different from what happened after 1964 up to, say, Well, he stopped at 77, but it actually went on till about 80. And I think we must accept that as part of our understanding of India's past. There's a general tendency these days to say, well, a lot of people say everything that was done in the first 30 years is wrong. These days, of course, they say everything that was done in the first 70 years is wrong, but that's a different story. So I'd say that those first 30 years are really in two parts. One is the Nehru part. I want to focus a little on that Nehru part. That's the part I grew up with. That's the part from which I perhaps derived most of my understanding of what the economy is, what we ought to be doing, and so on and so forth. The one thing that I find striking about that part, if you read this book, is the extent to which the finance ministers were not totally dominated by the prime minister. The number of cases where the finance minister had their way and could speak. Now, one of the reasons for this is, by and large, Nehru's finance ministers were professionals. If you look at the first two, who of course left rather quickly, John Bathai and Shetty, certainly Deshmukh, to a certain extent TTK also, who was an industrialist with good understanding. Morarji was not, but he came with a great deal of experience of provincial, state level development and planning and management and so on. So in many ways you could see this. You could see that in many instances, in fact, it's very interesting, you call Nehru a socialist, but none of his finance ministers were, except possibly TTK, who occasionally said yes, but certainly not the first two, certainly not Deshmukh, certainly not Morarji. And that was something which was very special, that you had a finance minister who really had a degree of independence. That is what is missing since then. That is what has gone. In the 2 years that I was in the finance ministry and was involved in the preparation of the budget, I can assure you that the Prime Minister's office played a much bigger role than the finance minister. He will confirm this for this, when S.V. Chauhan was a finance minister. I think I spent more time with in the Prime Minister's office explaining things rather than to the finance minister. I'm not sure the finance minister even understood what we were fully doing. But the Prime Minister would guide us, do this, do that, etc., etc. Now this intensity of control by the Prime Minister is very different from what you had in the Nehru era. And to some extent, I believe the positive outcome of the Nehru era was really the fact that not one ideology did not dominate all of economic policy. Have a look sometimes at this book which has come out by this historian from London School of Economics called Nehru's India, which really brings this out, that if you see the actual reality of what happened in the Indian economy and its politics, it is not the application of what could be called Nehru's ideology. And Nehru himself was a much more tolerant man. In fact, one of the things that he quotes on his page, that Nehru ran his cabinet as a gentle, considerate and democratic, never forcing a decision on his colleagues, some of them being distinguished men in their own right. And that aspect. Now, of course, one possible explanation for which somebody else you quote, B.K. Nehru. He said, well, Nehru did not understand economics too well, so he had to do this. I think you quote B.K. Nehru in one place. And if I see that period, the first period, do not see it simply as an application of socialist ideology or anything. One of the things, for instance, that I would mention, there were only two nationalizations then. One was of the state bank, the Imperial Bank, which became the state bank, and the second was of life insurance. And both of them were very, to some extent, provoked by what was the misuse of those financial institutions by some of the corporates, etc. Particularly in the case of life insurance. I think it was Dalmia who was accused of misusing it. So that was the only case. And when the Industrial IDR Act was passed, TTK was the only finance minister who, to some extent, sympathized with Nehru's ideology, actually said was assured, he was saying that I would assure them, that is industry leaders, that the government would not needlessly interfere with the industrial process. The government would not damage the climate that now exists in regard to the relationship between government and private enterprise. And this was a period, if you look at the numbers on corporate growth, and it is enormous. If between 1950 and 1964, I can assure you, if you look at the numbers, there's an extraordinary growth in the extent of corporate investment in relation to GDP, number of corporations who came up, the number of trading people who became manufacturing investors, and so on. I remember this, having had to sit down and write hundreds and hundreds of applications for shares for my family. So that was something which I can remember. This was late 50s, early 60s. And this is the thing that I would like to suggest. But after 64, too many things went wrong for us. First was the great drought crisis, or in the mid-60s, terrible one. 65 and 66, it was one of the worst droughts India's ever experienced. Second, wars, 62, 65, 71. That. Third, the political changes. One was the political change within the Congress party, which of course led to the split in 69. Second was the emergence of a non-Congress opposition. Perhaps 67 elections in UP was the first mark of that. And the political tensions became much more intense. That is also the beginning of the giveaway stuff by governments. 10-point program initially, then the 20-point program during the emergency, and so on. And that transformation of government as a giveaway organization, rather than as an organization which is promoting long-term development, really starts quite early on. So to me, in many ways, the Nehru era reflected certain dimensions of administration, of government decision-making, which need to be looked at much more carefully because they have disappeared. We have a system which is now not really a cabinet system. It's really a system controlled from the top. We now do not have that sense of democracy. You certainly have done much more to open up things for the private sector. You certainly have done much more to have much more rational trading policy than what we had in those days. But there is a lot that needs to be done, understanding that needs to be done in the Nehru era. The one thing that I would say is, people always say in the Nehru era, they emphasize self-reliance too much. They did not do enough for export promotion. And it's certainly true that India missed out on the boom in global trade, which started in the 60s. It was towards the end of the Nehru era that boom started. And the reason we couldn't do what happened in East Asia was this was the 15 years when we had a complete crisis on the political system, when there was so much fragmentation going on around the country and so on. Now, finally, I just want to say something that the Nehru era was very good. It was a very difficult area politically. You mentioned the Bombay one. I lived through that Amchi Bombay agitation. It wasn't just a riot. I can tell you for 4 days we had to be cooped up at home. It was violent. There were lots of deaths and so on. The language agitation in Tamil Nadu. The political climate of India then was far more divisive. And one of the things that happened over this period was probably some reduction. In many ways, it was much worse than what we are experiencing today in terms of like being locked up for 5 days because there are violent riots going on, people shooting and things like that. Now, I'm afraid some of that is going to be coming back. Look at Manipur, for instance. But by and large, that was something that was probably not that welcome in the Nehru era, but the economic side, the democracy side is certainly very welcome, and I hope it will also be recovered. You're going to write books on the next two era. He wants the finance secretary wanted you to stop at 2014. But I look forward to what you will have to say on that, because it's probably far more complicated than what you have been dealing with so far, when you look beyond 77. So let me stop here.
Thank you.
Fantastic, sir. I think this was an honest opinion. Mr. Nageswaran has some thoughts around it. Sir, I would like to give the mic to you, please.
Yeah, I'll be very quick because we're running behind schedule. One of the things we heard was that the first 30 years growth was about 3.5% on average. But if you really break it down, the 50s actually India grew at 5+% in real terms, and actually just barely behind South Korea. And then if you look at the 70s, it was a high inflation era globally. In fact, real growth was pretty bad everywhere. So it's really the 60s where we kind of lost our way, and as Mr. Desai pointed out, there were multiple factors, not just economic policy. So in that sense, probably just to enliven the proceedings, I can probably disagree with my illustrious predecessor that Mr. K Bhattacharya wasn't really being too kind to the finance ministers, but he was also probably accommodating the additional factors that were there around. But also, more importantly, I think Mr. Bhattacharya does lay out the facts, and I think we can pick it up ourselves as to how intrusive those policies were, instead of sort of imposing his judgment on us, the readers, which is what he does very well. And lastly, one more point, a perspective that comes out is the consistent difference of opinion and even public clashes with between the central bank and the finance ministry. And if you sort of put that in perspective, I think this institutional relationship has evolved really for the better these days. And I think that is something we should be very pleased about. These are the additional points I wanted to make. Thank you.
Fantastic. That brings us to the end of the discussion, though, but in case AKB, you have some points to make.
I think I just wanted to sort of express my gratitude and thanks to all the panelists and everybody here. Just one point, one of the reasons why I chose to take up this project was something that I haven't mentioned in the book, which is that I was meeting the current finance minister, and at the end of the meeting in her room, she took us to a stand, kind of a nameplate, and she said, you know, I am the first finance minister who has managed to get all the finance ministers' name and put it in a board. And I had a major difficulty in getting the exact dates and the files. So, I mean, I think that thought struck me. I said, if the finance minister of the country has a problem in getting the names of the finance ministers in place, so let me find out what all went on into it. And for me, it was learning for me, and I learned as I worked on various books, various even in the International Center, I must owe my gratitude to, because they have a very good library apart from the Nehru Library, and I had access to books which were completely out of print. So thank you IIC, and thank you everybody. This is all I would say. Thank you.
Fantastic. While 11 finance ministers, 30 years, and such an illustrious panel cannot be placed into an hour. We apologize for this 15-minute delay, but we can still take a question or two if everyone allows us. We can take a question or two. Okay, so can we have the mic for him, please? Sir, keep your questions very crisp, focused onto the book, and please state your name and what you do.
Actually, I don't have a question. I have a couple of comments. One, you were talking about industrial licensing and so on. The research that I did before we worked on the industrial policy reform in 1991, there was actually the background to industrial licensing came on the Defence of India Act, 1939. And it was really almost nothing to do with socialism, anything of that kind. It was just that the Indian bureaucracy, and I think all the IAS officers have left. So it was a sort of continuation from ICS to IAS. The only thing they knew was control. The whole objective of the Indian civil service was the control of the country. Of course, that was civil control, not so much economic control. But the point I'm just making is that the IDR Act, etc., really the origins were much more bureaucratic. But that's what the civil service knew what to do. It had nothing to do with socialism. So I think that's just one comment I want to make. The second was to do with the whole issue of devaluation, exchange, etc., and the import controls. That it is a fact that until the Plaza Accord in the 70s, all exchange rates were fixed, and all exchange rates were fixed, and it's only exceptional circumstances you had a devaluation. You were supposed to go off and ask the IMF, etc. And therefore, when there was a balance of payments problem, the natural thing was import controls or devaluation or a one-shot devaluation. And so at very different times, from times of capital flows, of course, flexible exchanges, etc. So you need to put that in context in terms of the kind of thinking that was going on at that time, which is the same sense that was meant by the panelists have mentioned. You have to go back and think what are the theories at that time, what are the thinking at that time, what are the reality at that time. Sorry, I didn't ask a question because they've answered. They've already answered all the questions.
Yeah.
Wasn't there an earlier devaluation in the 50s?
Yes, there was a devaluation in.
That was not had nothing to do with the trade policy. It was basically tied in with what those rascals in London were doing with the sterling balance.
Yeah. 1949, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So while we both were complained that while you were forming this panel, you had no female as a contributor to this. We apologize for that, but we'd like to make it up with the last question from the lady here. Please, ma'am, please ask the question.
I'm not an economist, but I'm married to one. And the good thing is that he's not only an economist, fortunately. My request to you, Mr. Bhattacharya, I look forward to reading your book, is to, if you can give a small upshot for the audience of the book, and also, like you said, the current finance minister was not aware of the finance ministers. Were you also surprised during your research and writing about some other things about the Indian economy and how it intersects with the politics of the day, etc.? One other comment I wanted to make is that all the speakers, none of them touched from the time, let's say, from 73, 74, when the politically things started going wrong, Sanjay Gandhi comes on the scene, and how that affected, if it affected, the economics and the economic policy of the time. Thank you.
Yeah. No, I think it's difficult for me to provide a summary of this book in such a short time. But what I would tell you is that the interplay between the finance ministers and the prime ministers in these 30 years is something that is a running story. And the other story, which I don't think we don't often recognize, is that the decisions in this 30 years may have been as dramatic as many of the decisions that have been taken in recent past, things like devaluation or bank nationalization. But what this book tries to reveal is, in spite of these decisions being presented as a big bang decision, devaluing the Indian currency by 57% or nationalizing 14 banks, but the level of internal as well as within the government, the debate that went in, that is something which I am not done adequate research for the current decisions, but I think that degree of debate and internal discussion is probably missing these days. So that's something which I feel is what we have lost in our public life and policy making. The debate on nationalization was preceded by a big debate on social control of banks, wherein Mrs. Gandhi herself had to really struggle with her own party colleagues on whether she can implement them. So similarly, devaluation. Within the committees, there was Bhutlingam who would take a view, and there was I.G. Patel was taking a different view. So I think that the level of debate and coming out in the open on those decisions is something that I find very interesting. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Sure.
Sir, please.
And this is really a defense of your book.
Yeah.
Because of...
Thank you for coming to my rescue now.
not having done so earlier. I think a gentleman was saying, why don't we all apply our minds to the future and
sure.
forget the past? I mean, you know, I believe a famous philosopher has said words to the effect that those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. So I think you have reminded us of the past.
Yeah.
Go buy the book, get it signed. You can have a discussion with AKB who's there and others as well. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.